Thank you. I'm just going to put this. Okay, so have you got a single, oh no, you can see my other slides, display settings. Just, you can only see one slide now?
Yes, that's right. That's
okay,
good.
All right, this is a very pretty picture of a shop in Boston in Massachusetts. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is my Churchill Fellowship, which I've done only recently this year. I've got this timing issue with this thing again, sorry. So I'll give you a bit of background. I'll talk why public procurement, what it actually is, how it works, and what some of the outcomes might look like, and then some questions. But I'm using particularly a sort of climate-friendly lens tonight. This is a beautiful raspberry field in Skane in southern Sweden. So my fellowship subject was looking at models and approaches by business and government that increase local food procurement by institutions. And now what I'm talking about when I'm talking about institutions is hospitals, unis, prisons, aged care, schools, hospitalities, other food service. Keep in mind that in these sort of, I don't know why it's doing that, I apologise. Keep in mind that when you're talking about food procurement, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of meals every day. So it's about food at a significant scale and how you can use the purchasing of that food by governments to actually create public good. So the great thing about public food procurement is that it allows you to change the food system through the purchasing decisions you make as a government. So you can choose the type of food the institutions purchase, you can choose who you buy it from, and also things like production methods. So this is where climate change friendly food comes into play. So values-based procurement is what I call it, because it's really about your values being reflected in public decisions. And my founding principle is that when you're spending public money, you should be creating public good. And so the values you might include in the contracts you have with your suppliers might be around increasing local sourcing because you want to create economic benefit. It might be about improving the quality of food so that it's healthier and your waste is reduced. It could be about having more climate-friendly food. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. To reduce the emissions in the food system. It could be about improving animal welfare, and it could be about increasing the diversity of suppliers, which includes having systems to make sure that small and medium enterprises can also participate. So this is not just a super duper corporate process. Don't you love this guy on the slide? This was actually by a Japanese artist. I just happened to see this in a gallery in Michigan, which was one of the places, Grand Rapids, Michigan, one of the places I visited. So when I went to these meetings, I met with a whole bunch of different people, but what I really wanted to do was to understand how they were actually doing values-based, sort of history of it was, what sort of tools and frameworks they use, some of the how-to, because this is what people are really interested in, like how do you actually do it? And then what sort of changes you might see in institutions and in the food system, and then on the broader economy and the environment where they're known. This is a Boston food hub, which is just outside of Boston, and it supports a lot of small-scale producers supplying into school meal programs particularly. Isn't this a great diagram? I love this. It's so fancy. But what it does, it shows that I met with different kinds of people because I really wanted to get different sorts of perspectives about how you do values-based procurement. So I met with researchers, I met with people that delivered programs, I met with people in government that create the policies, and I also met with some business people as well. So I got a real variety of perspectives. This was one of the most exciting models that I saw, and it was actually in the UK. It was a model called Dynamic Food Procurement. And this was essentially, it's two things. It's an online platform which allows all sorts of small and medium scale producers to upload what's for sale. And then it's attached to a logistics and provider and processor system. And then from there, it goes to the chefs. So it's like the whole thing is online. And it means that the chef in the kitchen knows exactly what they're purchasing, how the food was produced. And the other great thing about it is that from the kitchen's perspective is it simplifies the invoicing and deliveries and streamlines all of that. This model is actually now being rolled out all across the UK. And one of the reasons why I really love it is it this consolidation model really regionalises food that's served in institutions, and it results in like very short, transparent supply chains, and they're measuring things like the reduction in the emissions through transport, and then also the increases in things like regeneratively produced food, organically produced food, and chefs. The interesting thing about this one is that people often say, oh, if we're going to change something, it's going to mean that things are more expensive in kitchens. But in fact, this model proved that actually it could be more affordable to relocalise food systems and apply these other values in the purchasing decisions that big institutions are making. It's got really wide support from a whole lot of climate and sustainability organisations from across the UK. And it's a really exciting innovation. It's now actually being picked up in Copenhagen. The municipal government there has just started, and then they're also looking at it in Sweden too. And it's a platform that actually could potentially be used anywhere in the world. It's really, really interesting. When you hear people talk about how with climate change, the solutions might come from tech, this is the kind of solution that we might get, which would be very cool to have here. So just generally around the enablers, things that help to actually make this happen. Of course, it's leadership within institutions. It's also leadership from our politicians. And we need to use data to make sure we're making much better decisions. One of the other things I noticed a lot when I was talking to people was the importance of what I call soft infrastructure. What I'm talking about there is all of the people who, for example, organisations like RANT and other coalitions and alliances of people who collectively can apply pressure to governments to make these kinds of public good decisions, and that makes it a lot easier if everybody's sort of pushing in the same direction. So the kinds of outcomes that I saw, and these were fairly routine, were at an economic and institutional level. It means that there's more confidence from growers and producers and processors to actually increase the types of food they're producing to meet new contract requirements. So for a really great example, in Denmark, in Copenhagen now, all of their public meals, and it's about 120,000 meals per day, 90% of those are now organically sourced, using organically sourced ingredients. And that wasn't the case about 14 years ago. It was like less than 30%. So when you make these decisions at a political level, the market does respond. So growers do start to feel more confident about increasing the scale of their production in the way that's stipulated in the contracts. There are happier workforces, better regional economies. Community wellbeing is improved because people are much happier about these shorter, climate-friendly supply chains and production methods. It is things like food system self-reliance. So within regional areas, you know, you have increased knowledge around what's around you, and it builds that strength in local systems. And it also, really importantly, improves the freshness and quality of food, and there's new product developments or new crops are grown. So that sort of diversity in our food system is really important as well. I won't bore you with all of this, but suffice to say, in the report for the project, there's a lot of technical detail around how you would actually do this if we wanted to move things within Australia. And there's a bit of a process outline there and some tips from different places, which I've aggregated in a single diagram. There is a very nice infographic, which is a one-page overview. If you don't want to read the report, and probably unless you're really fascinated by this subject area, you wouldn't. But this really gives you a summary of the key things I found. And then part of the report also includes some recommendations about how you actually deliver this work. And it really needs to be led by organisations and alliances from outside government, and it needs to make sure that, you start talking with farmers very early in the process, the moment you start being interested in it. And we also need to do here in Australia is actually map the opportunity. We don't actually know what our governments do, how they spend our money at the moment, but we do know that it's a significant amount of money. And then the other point that I wanted to make was that all of these programs and policies, when you design them, you really need to think about how you can enhance the reputation and the profile of people that work in kitchens in these institutions, because most of them work under pretty trying conditions, really narrow budgets, and they don't get a good rap. So we need to shift that perception a little bit as well. And I've just realised that I did not even say where I went to, so I'm just going to tell you that now. The trip actually went to the US, Canada, England, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Ooh, that was quick.
Is that your record, Leah?
Sorry. I don't know why the slides kept jumping ahead there. That was a bit off-putting. So I feel like I've really raced through that, and that I should perhaps give you just a little bit about my own personal motivation about why I applied to do a Churchill Fellowship, which was way back in February 2019. And it was really, at that time, I was the state manager for an organisation called Eat Well Tasmania, which was around promoting seasonal food and promoting Tasmanian producers. But I really felt like what I was doing was tinkering. I couldn't have a big enough impact in what I was doing. So I started reading about procurement and the food that institutions buy, which is massive, massive volumes of food. I did a little calculation. Let me just read out these numbers for you. In Tasmania, we've got 2,000 hospital beds. So that's 6,000 meals a day. That's 42,000 meals per week. That's just in our hospitals. That's a lot of food, isn't it? It's nearly 50,000 kilos of veggies if everybody was eating the amount of veggies they should, and that's just from our hospitals. So you can see that because it's such a massive opportunity, this was my hypothesis. I thought that if we could get, businesses that are always preoccupied with sending everything away and feeding everybody else outside of Tasmania, if they saw a big opportunity like this, they might say, hang on a minute, actually we could just be supplying locally and start to set up, well, I mean, we do have the distribution systems to do it, but because there's no requirement in the contracts that our public institutions have to locally source, it doesn't happen. So that's the piece of work that needs to happen. We need to persuade the institutions, and that means persuading the politicians, that they should think about the money that they're spending and the public good that they could create through it. Now, one of the examples that I wanted to share with you, particularly because of the regenerative ag focus, was a couple of places that I went to. One was UC Berkeley, so the University of California, their Berkeley campus. And I met with a young woman who looks after all the procurement, sustainable food procurement for the residents that the students live in. And a couple of years ago, they made a decision that they would change the supplier for their meat, because they wanted the meat to be to improve the animal welfare, and then also for it to be produced in a way that was had much more reduced emissions than, you know, the usual, you know, after the feeding lot, lots of grain, that sort of thing. Now, not unsurprisingly, the amount of money that it costs for them to buy the same amount of meat was more. But what happened was the chefs were really clever and adjusted the menus, and people didn't eat as much meat. They ate more veggies, but they ate better meat. So from a nutritionist perspective, which is where I originally started with my interest in food systems, that was a really great outcome. So now there was this high welfare, you know, much lower emissions meat being used, and people were eating more veggies. And that was actually quite a consistent story when I spoke to people about them changing their protein sourcing, that they, and particularly in Europe as well, and that was the last part of my visit, they were talking a lot about regenerative agriculture and changing supply for the protein sources that they were using. At the moment, of course, they don't have sufficient scale, but it's expected that that will follow because now they're starting to require that in their contracts. So things will shift. And so I guess what I'm saying to you is it seems like a bit of a dry area and maybe even a little bit boring when you think about it, but it is a real possible way. It's kind of like this sleeping giant for how we could change how food is produced in Australia and make climate-friendly food much more mainstream, much more available, and, you know, served in our public institutions as well. That's
beautiful. Thank you, Leah. It's wonderful to hear of that. I mean, I would get an email or a phone call each week from somebody looking to source regenerative produce, whether it's veggies, it's often meat though, and even from large scale people like that are looking to, they want commercial quantities of meat, like large quantities of meat for things like jerky and things like that for value adding. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, that's another, I mean, that's the other possibility too, isn't it? That, I mean, it's going to happen. One of the interesting things in Europe particularly is they have the EU, because of the structure they have there. I mean, you know, the European Union issues directives to the countries that are part of the EU. And recently that's included a new strategy called, that's around paddock to plate strategy, which is around relocalising, regeneration and more ecological production of food. So there's this big shift on in Europe, and I think that they're way ahead of us, the way they have the conversation about agriculture. They talk about the problems in agriculture. They talk about the emissions in agriculture. What's interesting is about how we don't really talk about that very much in Australia, and that we're so preoccupied with trade and sending food away that the big conversation about agriculture and food here in Australia is just so different to Europe, just like it's like a whole other planet over there. I found it really fascinating, and I have to say I came back quite radicalised about how we can do the shift too, and that we really need to move on our politicians. They need to catch up. And the one thing I just wanted to finish with was that this year, the big climate meeting they have every year, so I think it's COP27. COP27. So this year in November, it's actually in Egypt this year, and for the first time ever, there's a whole day talking about food and agriculture. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that feeds down here to us in Australia, because the Europeans, of course, are pushing very hard for, big improvements in agriculture, because at the moment, I don't know if you know, but our climate emissions, the estimates are somewhere between 25 to 30% of our emissions are coming from our food system. So it's now actually the biggest contributor, because, of course, things like energy are reducing. So we need to change the conversation. And there's some great examples and some real inspiration overseas. We can do it too.
Awesome. Would anybody have any questions for Leah?
Even just a comment's fine. Just agree with me if you want, or disagree. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, go Flo.
So my background is European. I've done all my studies in Europe. And so what I've realized coming to Australia and doing agriculture here is, so no one is, not no one, just a little percentage of farmers are talking regenerative, because we have so much space and land available here. So compared to Europe, where we have 350 million or 360 million people on the same scale of land available. And I don't know how many hectares, I think per day it's 40,000 hectares are being built in Europe and not available for food anymore. I know that the scale in Australia for, let's say, arable land is small too, but not that small.
Well, if you think about Tasmania, if you look at a map of Tasmania, it's actually only a small part of the land. The percentage of the land, I think, is at 16% or something, 16% of the land is actually land under cultivation. But we think of ourselves as farmers. Well, there's lots of us that, there's lots of areas where you can't, and we shouldn't.
Yes.
But that's an absolutely totally valid point. Sometimes we can't compare ourselves. It doesn't make sense, except we know that how they made change happen, we can use it and adapt it ourselves if we want to.
Yeah. I mean, we have our extreme climates that we have in Australia is something that we don't or didn't have in Europe until the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And this is why a lot of farmers around the globe are looking on Australia. How do we manage that climate change?
And I don't know if we're the best place to look to.
I wouldn't agree to that, but
I mean, I think we could be. But I mean, I think part of the issue too, and this is what really struck me, is, this issue looking at is so mainstream. Like I could even while I was traveling, I saw some friends and stayed with some family, and when I talked to them about what I was doing, they all knew straight away what I was talking about. It's just this mainstream discussion, whereas here, because of the way we talk about food and agriculture, I just don't think we're quite there yet. But I'm really hopeful that that will change. And I think COVID should make it change, because we all saw these long supply chains collapse. Universally, we all turn towards more local farming. If you do any survey with people about, what sort of food they want, they're all heading in the same direction as, the kinds of issues that you're trying to address as a network. So it's almost like we need the politicians to catch up, because they're just at least 10 years behind. That 10 years that we had of the past federal government really set us back such a long way.
I would say sometimes it's even more.
Yeah, on some issues it probably is.
And I don't want to offend any Australian farmer.
So with that in mind, Leah, what's your next step? What's your next step from here as a radical?
Okay, so part of when you get a Churchill Fellowship is that you make a commitment to share what you've learned. So at the moment, I'm talking to groups big and small around what I've learned. I'm really trying to build up some interest and some momentum around it. There's a couple of hotspots in Australia. One of them is actually the ACT. And the ACT is a really interesting place. They have a sort of power sharing government there. The person who is in charge of agriculture and food and sustainability is actually a Greens party person. And they are at the moment developing a new food and fibre strategy. And they have values-based procurement in the draft, as well as some other issues. So at the moment, I'm kind of working to support people to change those policy settings where we can. And then the other thing that I'm trying to do is to get governments to at least explore the issue. So recently I made a submission to the Tasmanian government, which has gone past stage 1, so that's good, to actually have a project where we socialise this concept of values-based procurement. Talk with government departments, talk with farmers groups, talk with people in food service, the whole shebang, and see if we can work out who's interested in trying to do it, and also, what are the sorts of things that we could do together. Because one of the key findings I found was that it really needs a collective response, and it needs people from from the farm to food service to be working together on it, and then you can end up with some really nice outcomes. There in the there's not probably any policy glimmers of hope in agriculture at the moment, but it's interesting that when I was visiting with people, they were saying don't always look for it in the most obvious place. You might find a hook in another policy or strategy document. So at the moment, there's a couple at the federal level. They actually have a thing called a sustainable procurement policy. So technically speaking, any time the federal government spends money, it's supposed to turn its mind to things like sustainability. They also have the new people in finance have just changed another procurement document, which says that when the federal government spends money, it now has to be mindful of the climate impacts of its decisions, and that it also has to consider small and medium enterprises. So it's not always, it won't always be in the obvious place that you look, but there'll be other levers elsewhere that you can say, well, you've made a commitment to there. This is how you can do it if you did it thinking about food. Yeah, and then there's a couple of other places where, there might be a single sentence. This is how desperate I am. There might be a single sentence in a policy document that says, where possible, we will locally source food. And then that you can start a conversation. And one of the key things, while I went over to look at locally sourced food, on the very second visit that I had, I met with an amazing woman who said to me, don't narrow your focus like that, broaden things out so that you're trying to achieve multiple values at the same time. And so that was when I started to think more broadly around things like animal welfare, workers' rights, reducing climate emissions, and a whole bunch of other really great values that, and improved nutrition, so that you kind of open it up. The transition won't be fast. It's not like you flick a switch, but once we start to demonstrate how well it works, I think it'll gain momentum. I did a presentation for Deakin University a few weeks after I got back, and there were 265 people from around Australia registered for that session, and that was the first time there'd ever been a workshop on values-based procurement. So there's people out there. We kind of need to rally them, and that was, you said, what else am I doing? that's what I'm doing, trying to rally them.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So over there, did you run into cases where farmers' organisations were very engaged with this process?
Yeah, I did. And in fact, in almost every single, I mentioned earlier about alliances and how important they were in getting the political shift. And almost every single example where I heard about that, there were farming organisations involved. And sometimes it might be the peak body for a growers group, or it could be a group, you know, more specific like your own. I even met with a couple of peak bodies, one in Canada, a grower group that they were actually running programs on sustainable procurement. Other places like in Michigan, they have at the university there, they have a Centre for Regional Food Systems. There was farmers galore involved in that, so many different farming groups in it. There were food hubs, there were all sorts of different ways of being organised. So that was actually really critical, and that's one of my strong recommendations about why you need to, very early in the piece, talk to farmers and producers and also processors, because they're absolutely critical.
Lovely. Does anybody else have a question for Leah or comments? Beautiful. I'll